All right, let's do this. Ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling the Genesis creation story.
Oh, a classic.
Yeah, chapters 2.4 through 3.24 to be exact.
Okay, the Adam and Eve saga.
The one and only. Garden of Eden, forbidden fruit, the whole shebang. I'm sure everyone listening, knows the basics. But did you ever realize that Genesis actually has two creation stories?
It does, doesn't it?
Totally different vibes, too. Genesis 1, you've got your classic 6 days, bam, 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 creation done. But then chapter 2 rolls around and things get, well, a little jumbled.
A little more free-flowing, you could say.
Exactly. Like suddenly plants are popping up before humans. It's like, hold on, rewind. What happened to that neat and tidy 6-day schedule?
It's almost like a cosmic director's cut.
Right. Makes you wonder what the editors, well, the writers, I guess, were going for with that change. Like, why highlight the plants existing first in this version? What's the significance?
It's a good question. These little discrepancies, I guess you could call them, they really make you realize how much depth there is to uncover.
Layers upon layers. And speaking of under, what about the Garden of Eden itself? This isn't just any garden, right?
I know, not at all.
All right, so picture this. A river flowing through this lush landscape, branching off into 4 headwaters.
Oh, 4.
Yeah. The Pishon, Gihon, those names ring a bell.
I mean, vaguely.
Okay, but then you've got the Tigris and Euphrates, which are like legit, real rivers in Mesopotamia.
Ah, so they're grounding this mythical paradise in some actual geography.
Right, it's almost like they're trying to give it a real, tangible location, but within this paradise, you've got these 2 very important trees.
Iconic, you could say.
The tree of life and the tree of knowledge. And God's instructions to Adam are crystal clear. Eat from any tree, knock yourself out, except that one, or else.
High stakes.
Don't you think it's interesting that it's knowledge that's off limits? Not just some random fruit, but specifically knowing things.
It really does make you wonder what they were trying to say about knowledge itself, doesn't it?
Yeah, like was it seen as dangerous, something humans weren't ready for?
Or maybe it was more about control. God setting boundaries, saying, this one's for me, you don't get to decide this yet.
Oh, that's an interesting take. It brings in the whole question of free will and obedience, themes that like weave their way through the entire story.
Absolutely. But before we get too deep into that, let's not forget about Eve.
Oh yeah, Eve, created from Adam's rib, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. That's pretty powerful imagery, even for back then.
It's often seen as a statement of equality, right? Not just a companion, but someone made from the same stuff.
But even with this, profound connection, God recognizes that it is not good for man to be alone.
Interesting.
Because Adam, he gets to name all the animals, which, implies dominion, right?
Yeah, he's in charge.
But dominion over the whole animal kingdom still isn't enough. There's this void.
It really highlights that human need for connection, right?
Yeah.
Even in paradise, you need someone who's truly an equal.
Someone to share it all with. But then, of course, you've got the serpent slithering in, stage left. Why a serpent, though?
Good question. Out of all the animals God could have chosen.
They pick the one associated with, like, wisdom and deceit. Makes me think of that saying, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. The serpent's offering knowledge, but with a hidden cost.
And notice how he plants that seed of doubt. Not a blatant lie, just a question. Did God really say you couldn't eat from any tree?
Sneaky, right. It's like he's appealing to Eve's intellect. Don't blindly follow, question things. That must have been so tempting, especially with the promise of becoming like God, knowing good and evil.
Yeah, it taps into that human desire for understanding, but also for power, to be in control of your own destiny.
And in the end, Eve can't resist. She takes a bite, shares it with Adam, and boom, their whole world changes.
And how they see themselves.
Yeah, the eyes of both were opened and they realized they were naked. But this isn't just about, like, physical nakedness, right?
No, it's symbolic.
It's about realizing they're vulnerable, a loss of innocence.
It's the weight of their choice hitting them. Actions have consequences.
And speaking of weighty consequences, they hear God walking in the garden, and what do? They hide.
But you can't hide from the all-knowing.
Right. It's that feeling of guilt, of separation. Pretty relatable, actually.
No, absolutely. We've all been there.
Messing up and then trying to avoid the consequences. But in this case, the consequences are, pretty epic.
Yeah, we're talking about curses that shape, arguably, all of humanity. Epic is a good word for it. And these curses, they aren't just for Adam and Eve. They're for, well, everyone. Generations to come.
It's like that ripple effect. One choice, and then boom, the whole world changes. Let's unpack these curses a bit. starting with the serpent, condemned to crawl on its belly, eating dust. What do you think the writers were going for here?
It's a punishment, obviously, taking away that sly, clever tempter role he had.
Hmm.
But it's symbolic too, right? Serpents down in the dirt, the lowest point, literally. It's like this visual representation of, falling from grace.
And it's interesting how the serpent isn't like completely eliminated, just diminished.
Yeah.
It's like that struggle between good and evil. It's baked into existence from that moment on, always going to be there.
Exactly, yeah. Not a clean win. It's this constant push and pull. And then you've got Eve's curse, which, I mean, this is where things get a little tricky.
This is the one that's caused, well, centuries of debate.
Yeah, pain in childbirth, desire for her husband, him ruling over her.
You can see how people interpret that as, reinforcing patriarchy, women being subordinate to men.
Right, and those interpretations have been used to justify all sorts of, well, inequality, to put it mildly. But there are other ways to read it,
Oh, I'm curious, what are some other perspectives on this?
Well, some argue that the desire for your husband bit,
Mm.
that it's more about like a longing for a connection, for intimacy, not about wanting to be dominated.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the ruling over part,
Right.
that it's not, God's ideal plan, but a consequence of the fall, a disruption of that original harmony, that equality they had in Eden.
So, not divinely ordained male dominance, but more like the impact of sin on human relationships.
Exactly. Things getting messed up, out of whack. It's acknowledging, that these verses have been used to justify some pretty awful stuff. But the text itself might be, well, more nuanced than those interpretations allow.
It's food for thought, definitely. Especially since these verses, they're still being debated, reinterpreted today. It's a conversation that's still evolving.
For sure. But we can't forget about Adam. He gets his own curse too. Toil and labor, sweating it out to make a living.
Yeah, that's a rough one. Backbreaking work, trying to get food from the ground.
And it's interesting, right? He's tied to the earth, the very thing he was made from.
Oh, I see what you mean.
It's like a reminder of his mortality. Life, death, it's all part of the package now, the human experience post-fall.
And it makes you think about work itself, right? Is it a punishment, a burden? Or can it be, meaningful, even fulfilling, even with the sweat and the toil? The Genesis story, it seems to suggest, well, maybe a bit of both.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely brings up those questions about, the role of work in our lives and how our relationship with it's changed over time.
Yeah.
But even in the midst of all these curses, there's this moment of, what, compassion? God gives them clothes, garments of skin, clothing them, after they realize they're naked.
It's almost like a tender gesture, acknowledging their vulnerability, offering protection. Like, even though they messed up, they're not completely abandoned.
Right. There's still that care. And it's after this that things take a really, really big turn. God realizes that Adam and Eve, they've become like us, knowing good and evil. And that's a whole other can of worms.
Now it's not just breaking a rule. It's about, like, their very nature changing. They've crossed this line, gained knowledge that was, well, forbidden.
And it comes at a price, a steep one. Banished from Eden, from that tree of life. And to make sure they don't sneak back in, you've got cherubim and a flaming sword guarding the way.
Wow.
Talk about dramatic. It's the ultimate loss, right?
Mhm.
Not just paradise, but that direct connection with God.
It's like that flaming sword is a symbol. You can't go back. The choice is made, can't undo it. They have to live with the consequences.
And it's not just physical consequences either. It's emotional, spiritual. This story, it doesn't sugarcoat it.
Yeah.
Sin, suffering, separation from God, it's all part of the deal now.
It's almost like, well, the template for the human experience.
Yeah.
We all make those choices. Those eat the apple moments lead to consequences we didn't see coming, and we have to deal with it.
Exactly. We change, our perception changes, and suddenly we're facing some hard truths. And that's what makes this story so, well, so enduring. It's relatable no matter what culture, what time period. It's about human nature, the choices we wrestle with, and yeah, what happens after.
But even in the, darkness, there's this little glimmer of hope. Adam names his wife Eve because she would become the mother of all the living. Life goes on, even in this fallen world.
It's a good point. It's that resilience, that continuation. The human story, it keeps going. And maybe that's the most important thing to take away from this whole creation narrative. Even when things are broken, there's still that potential for love, for growth, for, well, redemption.
It's a powerful idea, right? That even after everything goes wrong, there's still that potential for, well, for good. But it makes you wonder, Why even give them the choice in the first place? I mean, if the consequences are so huge,
Right.
why not just make a perfect paradise? Everyone follows the rules and no one eats any forbidden fruit. Happy ending.
Ah, but that brings up the whole question of free will, doesn't it?
Oh, I see what you mean.
If you can't choose wrong, is there
Hmm.
really any choice at all? Maybe that ability to, you know, mess up, to disobey, maybe that's part of what makes us human.
So it's not about being perfect. It's about like learning from your mistakes, growing through experience, even the tough stuff.
Exactly.
But that image of Eden, that lost paradise, it just seems to stick with us. Why do you think that is?
It's interesting, isn't it? Maybe it's that longing for a simpler time, for innocence, for that connection with nature, with each other. Think about how often paradise shows up in art, in stories. It's this, like, universal theme.
Like we're all trying to get back to something we lost. Maybe not a literal garden, but that sense of, I don't know,
Yeah,
wholeness.
like a blueprint for utopia, even if it's, ultimately unattainable.
Right, and maybe it's not about actually reaching it, but more about striving for those ideals in our own lives, our communities, pursuing knowledge, yes, but also cultivating compassion, realizing we're all connected.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here: creation, temptation, consequences, the whole nine yards. But for someone listening who might be thinking, all right, this is all fascinating, but it's an old story, what does it have to do with me now? What would you say?
That's what's so amazing about it, I think. It's an ancient story, sure, but the themes, they're totally timeless, still relevant today just as much as they were, what, thousands of years ago?
Like, even if you don't believe in the literal Garden of Eden, there are still lessons to be learned.
Absolutely. Like, take the idea of choices and consequences.
That's pretty fundamental, right? We're all making decisions, big and small, every single day, and then dealing with the fallout.
Exactly. And the Genesis story, it gives you this framework for understanding that,
Yeah.
recognizing that your actions, they have an impact on yourself, on others.
It's like this cosmic reminder. Think before you act. Consider the consequences. But it's not just about your outward actions.
Oh no, it goes deeper than that. It's about your inner world too, those internal battles we all face.
Like shame, guilt, wanting to make things right.
Exactly. We all have those moments where we're, hiding from God, metaphorically speaking, of course, when we feel like we messed up, fell short.
And that's what makes these kinds of stories so powerful, right? They give us a language for those feelings, for those inner struggles. It helps us make sense of, well, of being human, all the complicated parts.
Yes. And by exploring it all, through the lens of this ancient story, you gain a new perspective on your own life, your own struggles. It's like tapping into this wisdom that's been passed down for generations.
So it's not just about knowing the story, it's about engaging with it, really digging into the meaning, the psychological, spiritual insights it offers.
Exactly. And maybe the most important thing to remember is that even when things are broken, even when you feel lost, disconnected, there's always that possibility of redemption.
That's a good note to end on. There's hope, even after the fall. That potential for growth, for change, it's always there.
It is. And it's within each of us. The Genesis story, with all its layers and, complexities, it reminds us of that. Our shared journey as humans, the challenges, the choices, and that possibility of, finding our way back to wholeness, to peace.
Beautifully said. So, to everyone listening, I hope this deep dive into the Genesis creation story has given you something to think about. It's more than just an old text, it's a reflection of ourselves, a guide for navigating life, and yeah, a source of wisdom that stood the test of time. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep searching for those connections in yourself and in the world. Until next time, happy diving.